That entire scene, or the lyrics for it anyway, come directly from Macbeth's witches scene. And so today we are going to look at how this scene from Macbeth Act 4, Scene 1 has influenced our expectation of witches ever since. First, though, let's look at what the people believed during Shakespeare's time. So, Shakespeare's time is called the Renaissance, but they had a lot of beliefs that were held over from the Middle Ages. And one of those beliefs was a true belief in witches. They believed that witches were real, they were very powerful, and they were very frightening. Witchcraft was blamed for a lot of unexplainable events. So, things that we know are scientifically understood were still unexplainable in Renaissance science. So, things like lost crops or sudden ill livestock, like if several of your cattle suddenly died, or even human accidents like broken legs or unexplainable illnesses or hair loss or unexplainable bruises would be blamed on witchcraft because they, one, believed in witches, and two, did not have enough scientific knowledge to have a real medical explanation. And of course, the people who were most likely to be accused of witchcraft were women who lived alone because they were social outcasts. These were usually poor people, widows, or women who did not fit the expected social expectations of women. And that is true if you are familiar with the Crucible. That is the same time period, really, like the 1600s is when we're talking about. And that is Shakespeare's lifetime. That is also like the Salem witch trial time period here in America. So those are really parallel timelines. And all those same things that were true about witchcraft belief in the early Americas were also true of witchcraft beliefs in medieval and Renaissance England. It was such a pervasive belief, in fact, that even King James, who was the king during the later part of Shakespeare's life, was obsessed with witches. He was fascinated with witchcraft and studied it so much that he even wrote a book about it called Demonology. So when we start to read Hamlet next week, you will note that there are ghosts and magic in Hamlet, and that too was a true belief that people during Shakespeare's time did not consider fiction, did not consider it was not science fiction. It was truth. It was possible, and it was frightening. So when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, he, of course, was very aware that witches were a believed existence in his time period, but he also was very aware that they were interesting to King James. Macbeth was written for King James, and there's a long, complicated story about why he wrote that for King James. But the short of it is that King James was his new sponsor. Queen Elizabeth had died. She was a huge patron of the arts. King James, not so much. He had a short attention span. He wasn't super interested in the theater, but he was still funding Shakespeare's theater troupe. So he wanted to write some plays that would please King James. For that reason, Macbeth, first of all, is the shortest play he ever wrote. And two, it includes witches very heavily because he knew that was something that would definitely keep the attention of King James. And because the witches were such a popular element of Macbeth, and because Macbeth was such a popular play, the way that Shakespeare wrote the witches in Macbeth, and particularly in Act 4, Scene 1, has influenced our expectations of witches to this day in movies and television. And there are three main ways that that is true. First of all, we now expect witches to come in threes. And here are some examples of how in television and in films, witches tend to come in threes. But that would not have been the case before Macbeth. Before Macbeth was written, 4 would have been a more appropriate number for witches. If you know anything about Wicca or witchcraft, you might know that 4 is actually the powerful number. In order to make a circle, which of course 4 corners makes it look like a square, but you just round it out a little bit and it's a circle. You have to have 4 people to make the circle complete. There are 4 directions: north, south, east, west. A corner represents each of those 4 directions. There are also 4 elements: earth, air, water, fire. And so you need 4 people to represent those elements. And when practicers of Wicca or witchcraft get together, they need 4 people. If you've ever seen The Craft, you know that that's the case. And that movie actually calls upon that. But when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, either because of the number of actresses he currently had in his troupe, or because the number 3 is a powerful thematic device and plot sequencing, he decided to depict the Weird Sisters as being a group of 3. And if we were going to read the play Macbeth, I would get into more detail about how Hecate, who is mentioned here, is the queen of the witches, and there's a whole side plot where she gets angry at the main 3 witches for meeting with Macbeth without her. But suffice it to say, since we are not reading the entire play of Macbeth this year, that there are 3 witches who are prominent characters in Macbeth. They show up in Act 1, Scene 1. First scene, as soon as the curtain rises, are 3 witches on stage, and they meet with Macbeth then in Act 1, Scene 3, and then they show up again a couple of other times in groups of 3. Hence, 3 witches are now the popular number. The second thing that our current witches get from Macbeth is the cauldron. The image of 3 witches standing around a cauldron is now iconic. If you just Google 3 witches, you will most likely get some search results that have them standing around a cauldron. And this whole concept that witches use a cauldron to brew some kind of concoction that includes animal parts and human body parts and all kinds of bizarre, mysterious, exotic ingredients comes from Macbeth, Act 4, Scene 1. And we'll read their entire brew here in just a little bit. But just know the whole idea of witches standing around a cauldron is from Shakespeare. Here are some examples. These are really just out of the top 3 things that I Googled and they came up. And then this one has a pun from Act 4, Scene 1 as well. The third thing that comes from Act 4, Scene 1 are the words and the ingredients. When you see witches in pop culture, in television shows, movies, even cartoons, the witches are quite often going to say, double, double, toil and trouble. And that phrase comes from Macbeth. When I was a kid, witches in like Looney Tunes would say this all the time. And it was a phrase that, you know, when you're walking through Walmart during Halloween and there's a cauldron and you pick up something and stir it and just pretend and goof around, you're going to say double, double, toil and trouble, because that's what witches say. And it comes from Act 4, Scene 1. And quite often, when witches in a TV show or a movie start collecting ingredients to put in a cauldron and they start stirring things up and it's bubbling, the things that they're throwing in there are almost always a parody of the witch's brew that Shakespeare wrote in Act 4, Scene 1 that we are about to read. And some other lines that are just as famous. The something wicked this way comes that you heard in the Harry Potter scene a minute ago is directly from Act 4, Scene 1. And the calling witches the Weird Sisters is also something that was popularized by Shakespeare. He did not invent that phrase. The concept of a weird, W-Y-R-D, meaning a group of witches, already existed, and it was just a concept that Shakespeare was using. But because he used it in his popular play, it has become even more widespread and widely used for groups of witches. There is a band in, I think it's the 4th Harry Potter movie, called the Weird Sisters, and they are again named after this scene. Here are some other videos, and I will link these on Kidum if you want to look up some more of them. We will watch at least one of them here in just a minute. Just a few other important things about the witches that you need to know. First of all, you will notice that the witches are not speaking in the regular blank verse, which means unrhymed iambic pentameter. They use their own meter and they do rhyme. They speak in rhymes, which stands out in a Shakespeare play. And I'm going to let y'all determine what the meter is. I'm not going to give that one away, but I will tell you that it's not iambic pentameter, which makes it stand out in terms of meter from the rest of the text of the play. All right, so let's jump over now and see the Animaniac version of Macbeth. This scene is so popular that it has been redone by Looney Tunes and by all kinds of different uh, genres. I think that's enough. All right, so now that you know a little bit about the background of the Macbeth witches, pop over to Kidum and you can check out how you would do it. And you can make up your own witch's brew before you open up and read the real thing.